Good evening. Welcome back to Bleak Fears. Tonight we're bringing you 11 deeply unsettling true Pacific Northwest horror stories that will forever change how you view the forests, coastlines, and back roads of this region. These are not fictional tales, but documented experiences from real people who encountered something profoundly wrong in the shadowed corners of Washington and Oregon. Each account comes directly from individuals who survived these disturbing incidents and chose to share their testimony so others might recognize the warning signs. The wilderness we venture into for peace and beauty can conceal terrors beyond ordinary comprehension. From isolated stretches where people vanish without explanation to locations where reality itself seems to fracture. If you're drawn to authentic horror grounded in real events, subscribe to Bleak Fears and turn on notifications so you won't miss our deep dives into the most haunting true stories from America's darkest corners. Once you've heard these chilling testimonies, leave your own unexplained Pacific Northwest encounters in the comments section. We're building a community where witnesses can document the inexplicable events that official reports dismiss or ignore. Now, let's begin with our first account. My name is Adhara, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a marine biologist, which means I spend a lot of time in places most people only visit on vacation. Cape Disappointment in Washington is one of those places. It sits right where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean. And the name isn't just dramatic, it's accurate. The weather there is unforgiving. The cliffs are dangerous, and the fog rolls in so thick you can't see your own hand sometimes. But that's exactly why I was there in October 2021. I was conducting research on tide pool ecosystems, documenting how different species adapt to the extreme tidal variations in that area. I arrived at the beach around 5:30 in the morning, well before sunrise. The tide would be at its lowest point around 6, giving me a solid 2-hour window to work before the water came rushing back in. I'd done this kind of field work hundreds of times before, so I wasn't nervous. I had my waterproof notebook, my specimen containers, my camera, and enough layers of clothing to stay warm in the October cold. The parking area was completely empty when I arrived, which wasn't surprising. Most tourists don't want to be on a beach in near-freezing temperatures in the dark. The fog was already settling in as I made my way down the rocky path to the beach. I could hear the foghorn from the lighthouse nearby, that deep, mournful sound that cuts through everything else. The beams swept across the water every few seconds, but it barely penetrated the fog. By the time I reached the tide pools, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 yards at best. The rocks were slippery with seaweed and sea spray, so I moved carefully, my headlamp cutting a thin beam through the gray morning. I started my work methodically, the way I always do. I was documenting a particular species of starfish that had been showing unusual population patterns. I photographed specimens, measured them, recorded water temperature and salinity levels. The sound of the waves was constant, crashing against the rocks with a rhythm that becomes almost meditative when you're focused on your work. The foghorn kept sounding in the background. Everything felt normal, routine even, until I looked up from my notebook around 6:15. That's when I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was just another early morning visitor, maybe a photographer trying to capture the fog and the dramatic coastline. The figure was standing down the beach from me, maybe 50 yards away, right at the edge of where my vision ended and the fog took over completely. They were just standing there, facing the ocean, completely still. I couldn't make out any details because of the distance and the fog, just a dark silhouette of a person. I waved, more out of habit than anything else, but they didn't respond. I went back to my work. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. I was crouched over a particularly interesting tide pool, using my macro lens to photograph some unusual shell formations, when something made me look up again. The figure was still there, in exactly the same position, They hadn't moved at all, same stance, same spot, still facing the ocean. I found that a little odd, but people do strange things at beaches. Maybe they were meditating or just lost in thought. I've seen people stand in one spot for a long time watching the water. I returned to my documentation, but as I worked, I found myself glancing up more frequently. Each time I looked, the figure was still there, absolutely motionless. The waves were getting larger as the tide started to shift, and I noticed that water was now washing around the person's legs with each wave. They were standing in the surf zone, and the water had to be incredibly cold, but they didn't move. They didn't step back, didn't adjust their position, nothing. Just standing there as waves crashed around them. I felt the first real prickle of unease then. Something about the absolute stillness wasn't right. Even if someone was deep in meditation or thought, the human body makes involuntary movements. You shift your weight. You adjust your balance when waves hit you. You react to cold water. This person wasn't doing any of that. They looked more like a statue than a living human being. I stood up from my crouch, my knees protesting after being bent for so long. I kept my eyes on the figure, waiting to see some movement, some sign of life. The fog was still thick, swirling around in patterns created by the wind off the ocean. The figure remained perfectly still. A larger wave came in, washing up to what must have been their waist, and still nothing. No reaction at all. I started to feel genuinely concerned. Maybe this person was in some kind of medical distress. Maybe they'd had a stroke or were experiencing a mental health crisis. I called out, my voice barely carrying over the sound of the waves and the wind. No response. I called out again, louder this time. Nothing. The figure just stood there in the surf, motionless as the rocks around us. I checked my phone, thinking I might need to call for help, but I had no signal. That wasn't unusual for this location. The cliffs and the remote area meant cell service was spotty at best. I looked back at the figure, trying to decide what to do. Should I pack up my equipment and hike closer to check on them? Should I run back to my car and drive to somewhere with cell service to call emergency services? But what would I even say? There's someone standing very still on the beach? I decided to watch for another minute to see if they would move. I counted to 60 in my head, my eyes locked on that dark silhouette in the fog. The waves kept coming. The foghorn kept sounding. The figure didn't move even a fraction of an inch. It was like watching a photograph, except the water around the figure was clearly moving, clearly real and dynamic. Only the person remained frozen. Then the fog shifted. The wind changed direction slightly, and for just a moment, maybe 5 seconds at most, the fog cleared enough that I could see the beach more clearly. My heart stopped. There was no one there. The stretch of sand where the figure had been standing was completely empty. Just waves washing up on the shore, just wet sand and scattered rocks. No person, no footprints that I could see from my distance. Nothing. I stood there in shock, my scientific mind trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The fog rolled back in almost immediately, obscuring the area again, but I'd seen clearly in that brief window. No one was there. I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the October temperature. Had I been hallucinating? Was there something wrong with my vision? I'd been focusing on small details through my camera for over an hour. Could that have caused some kind of visual distortion? But I knew what I'd seen. For at least 20 minutes, I'd been watching a figure stand motionless in the surf. I'd seen waves wash around it. I'd seen it maintain its position despite the force of the water. And then, when the fog cleared, nothing was there. I needed to know. Despite every instinct telling me to pack up and leave, I needed to see that spot up close. I gathered my equipment quickly, not bothering to organize it properly, just shoving everything into my backpack. Then I started making my way down the beach toward where the figure had been standing. The rocks were treacherous, and I had to move slowly, but I kept going. It took me about 10 minutes to cover the distance. The fog was still thick, and I used my GPS to make sure I was heading in the right direction. When I reached the area where I'd seen the figure, I stopped and looked around carefully. The beach was empty. The tide was coming in faster now, and water was washing over the sand in a steady rhythm. I looked down at the sand near my feet, searching for footprints, for any evidence that someone had been standing here. That's when my blood ran cold. There were footprints. I could see them clearly in the wet sand, even as the waves started to wash them away. They were human footprints, bare feet from what I could tell, and they led from further up the beach down to exactly where I'd seen the figure standing. I followed them with my eyes, watching their path through the sand. They walked down the beach, moved into the surf zone, and then continued straight into the ocean. They didn't turn around. They didn't lead back out. The footprints simply walked into the water and disappeared. I stood at the edge where the last footprint was visible, watching as the waves washed it away. Then I looked out at the ocean, at the gray water disappearing into gray fog, and I felt a fear that I'd never experienced before. It wasn't the fear of a predator or a physical threat. It was something else, something that made me question the fundamental nature of reality. I didn't stay to finish my research that day. I hiked back to my car as quickly as I could, my equipment banging against my back. I drove to the nearest town and sat in a coffee shop for an hour, drinking terrible coffee, and trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe I'd seen someone who'd gone swimming and then left the beach while the fog obscured them. Maybe the footprints belonged to someone else entirely, and the timing was just coincidental. Maybe my tired eyes had played tricks on me in the pre-dawn darkness and fog. But I didn't believe any of those explanations, and I still don't. I've been back to Cape Disappointment several times since then for other research projects. I've never seen the figure again, but sometimes, when the fog is particularly thick and I'm working near the water, I feel like I'm being watched. I find myself looking up constantly, scanning the beach, checking to make sure I'm alone. And I never stay past sunrise anymore. Whatever I saw that morning, whatever walked into the ocean and didn't come back, I don't want to see it again. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some things that happen in the fog should stay there. My name is Franco, and I've been driving trucks for almost 12 years now. I haul freight up and down the I-5 corridor between Portland and Seattle, sometimes making the trip 3 or 4 times a week. When you spend that much time on the same stretch of highway, you get to know every exit, every rest stop, every weird little landmark along the way. The road becomes as familiar as your own living room. You stop paying attention to most things because everything just becomes background noise. But there's one night I'll never forget. One stretch of highway that I refuse to drive past anymore after dark. And it all happened near mile marker 32. It was February 2018, middle of winter, and I was running late on a delivery. I'd hit traffic coming out of Portland because of an accident, and by the time I got up near Olympia, it was past 2 in the morning. The highway was almost empty at that hour, just the occasional car passing in the other direction. Rain was coming down steady, the kind of persistent drizzle that's just heavy enough to make your wipers work overtime, but not heavy enough to really qualify as a storm. The road was black and wet, reflecting my headlights back at me, and the darkness on either side was absolute. No streetlights out there, no buildings, just forest pressing in close on both sides. I felt something off with my rig around mile marker 34. There was a vibration coming through the steering wheel that shouldn't have been there, a kind of wobble that made me think I might have a tire issue. I wasn't about to risk a blowout at highway speed, especially not in the rain, so I started looking for a place to pull over. There aren't a lot of proper pull-offs on that stretch, just narrow shoulders with trees right up against the road, but I knew there was a slightly wider section coming up near mile marker 32. I slowed down and guided the truck onto the shoulder, putting on my hazards. The rain was lighter than I'd thought, more of a mist, really. And when I killed the engine, everything went quiet except for the tick of cooling metal and the occasional whoosh of a car passing on the highway. I grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket and climbed down from the cab. The air was cold and damp, that bone-deep wetness that the Pacific Northwest does so well in winter. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight as I walked around to check the tires. The right rear tire on the trailer looked a little low, but nothing critical. I'd check the pressure properly at my next stop. I was just finishing my inspection when I heard it. A child crying. The sound was coming from the woods, maybe 30 or 40 feet off the road. It was unmistakable, that particular kind of sobbing that kids do when they're really upset, with those hitching breaths between cries. My first thought was that there'd been an accident. Maybe a car had gone off the road, and I just hadn't seen it in the dark. I called out, asking if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. The crying continued, but nobody answered. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound and started walking off the shoulder into the trees. The ground was soft and muddy, my boots sinking in with each step. The trees were thick, mostly evergreens, and their branches hung low enough that I had to duck under them. The crying seemed to stay at the same distance ahead of me, never getting closer, but never fading away either. That's when I saw the first shoe. It was a small sneaker, a kid's shoe, sitting right in the middle of what looked like a deer trail. It was muddy but looked relatively new. I picked it up, shining my light around, and spotted another shoe about 10 feet further along the trail, then another one beyond that. They were forming a path leading deeper into the woods. The crying continued from that direction, and I felt my chest tighten with worry. Some kid was out here in the dark and the cold, and from the sound of it, they were in distress. I followed the shoes. There were 5 or 6 of them in total, all different sizes and styles, which struck me as strange even in my worried state. Why would there be multiple shoes from different kids? But I didn't stop to think about it too much. I just kept following the crying, stepping over fallen branches and pushing through underbrush. My flashlight beam swept back and forth, searching for any sign of the child or signs of an accident. The strange thing was that no matter how far I walked, the crying never got any louder. It stayed at exactly the same volume, the same distance away, like I was walking on a treadmill and not actually making any progress. After what felt like 10 or 15 minutes of hiking through the woods, a small rational part of my brain started sending up warning flags. This didn't feel right. The crying was too consistent, too unchanging. Real crying varies in intensity, speeds up or slows down, but this just kept going at the same steady pace. I stopped walking and stood still, trying to get my bearings. The crying continued somewhere ahead of me. I turned around, intending to head back to my truck, and that's when my heart nearly stopped. I could see lights through the trees behind me. Red and yellow lights. My truck's hazard lights, but they looked close, way too close. I couldn't have walked more than a couple 100 feet from the road, could I? I started walking back toward the lights, moving faster now, feeling a creeping sense of wrongness settling over me. The trees seemed different somehow, arranged in patterns I didn't remember passing. The ground felt different under my feet. I pushed through a final screen of branches and stumbled back onto the shoulder of the highway, and there was my truck. Hazard still blinking, exactly where I'd left it. But something was very wrong. I pulled out my phone to check the time, and the screen showed 3:28 in the morning. That couldn't be right. I'd pulled over, just after 2. I'd been in the woods for maybe 15 or 20 minutes at most. There was no way almost an hour and a half had passed. I checked my phone again, thinking the time display had glitched, but it showed the same thing. 3:28 a.m. Then my truck horn blared, a long, sustained blast that made me jump out of my skin. I hadn't touched the truck. I was standing 15 feet away from it. The horn kept blaring for about 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly. In the sudden silence that followed, I became aware that the crying had stopped. The woods behind me were completely quiet now. No sound at all except the whisper of wind through the trees. I walked around to the driver's side of my truck on shaking legs and climbed back into the cab. Everything looked normal inside. The keys were where I'd left them. My coffee in the cup holder was still lukewarm, but when I looked at the GPS unit mounted on my dash, my blood went cold. The screen showed my route history. the little breadcrumb trail that tracks where you've been. According to the GPS, I'd walked in a complete circle. The track showed me leaving the truck, moving through the woods in what looked like a random wandering pattern, and then coming back to the exact spot where I'd started. But that's not what I'd experienced. I'd walked in a straight line, following the crying, following the shoes. I'd never turned around, never circled back, until I deliberately decided to return to the truck. Yet the GPS clearly showed me walking in loops and circles, covering the same ground multiple times. The total distance it recorded was almost 2 miles. 2 miles in the space that had felt like a few hundred feet. I sat there in the cab, staring at that GPS track, trying to make sense of what had happened. The rational explanations didn't fit. I couldn't have been disoriented enough to walk in circles for nearly 90 minutes without realizing it. I couldn't have covered 2 miles of rough terrain in the dark without noticing. And I couldn't explain the crying that never got closer, the shoes arranged in a trail, or why my truck horn had blared on its own. I started the engine with trembling hands and pulled back onto the highway. I drove straight through to Seattle without stopping, even though I was exhausted and shaken. When I got to the warehouse to unload, one of the other drivers commented that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't tell him what had happened. I didn't tell anyone for a long time because I knew how it would sound. Crazy, paranoid, like something from a campfire story. But I did some research later, when I'd had time to process everything. I looked up missing persons cases along that stretch of I-5, particularly involving children. What I found made my skin crawl. Over the past 30 years, there have been at least a dozen reports of people hearing children crying in the woods near that section of highway. 4 people went missing after investigating those cries, vanishing, without a trace. 2 of them were truck drivers. Their rigs were found on the shoulder near mile marker 32, engines still running, but the drivers were never seen again. I requested route changes after that. I told my dispatcher I wanted to avoid I-5 between Olympia and Tacoma, said I'd take the longer route around, even if it added time to my deliveries. He gave me grief about it at first, but I was insistent, and eventually he stopped assigning me loads on that corridor. I still drive through Washington, still make the Portland to Seattle run sometimes, but I take Highway 101 along the coast or Route 12 through the mountains. Anything to avoid that stretch of road, sometimes late at night, when I'm driving through dark, empty stretches of highway. I think about those missing drivers. I think about how close I came to being another name on that list. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd followed that crying just a little bit further into the woods, if I'd kept walking instead of turning back. Would I have found what I was looking for? Or would I have just kept walking in circles until something found me instead? I don't know, and I never want to find out. Have you ever heard something in the darkness that made you follow it, even when every instinct told you to turn back? Tell me in the comments what pulled you forward, and what made you finally stop. My name is Huxley, and I've spent the last 20 years working as a forestry surveyor in Washington State. Most people don't really understand what that means, so I'll explain it simply. I go into forests, often areas that haven't been touched by humans in decades, and I assess them for timber value, environmental impact, and overall health. I mark boundaries, catalog tree species, measure growth rates, and document anything unusual. It's solitary work that requires you to be comfortable with isolation. In over 2 decades, I've seen just about everything these woods have to offer. Or at least, I thought I had until June 2020. I was contracted to survey a section of private timberland in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, east of Mount St. Helens. The area hadn't been actively logged since the early 70s, which made it particularly interesting from a forestry perspective. I wanted to see how the forest had recovered and regenerated over 50 years without human intervention. The logging company that owned the land was considering whether to harvest again or sell it for conservation, and they needed detailed assessments before making that decision. The access road into the survey area was barely visible, overgrown with brush and small trees that had sprouted up through cracks in the old pavement. I had a truck with high clearance and four-wheel drive, but even then I was scraping bottom on some of the rougher patches. The forest here was dense, that thick temperate rainforest growth that the Pacific Northwest is known for. Massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even at noon the light filtering through was dim and green-tinted. I'd been hiking through the survey grid for about 3 hours, making notes and taking measurements, when I came across something that immediately struck me as wrong. There was a logging truck sitting in a small clearing about 100 yards off the main road. It was an old model, probably from the 60s based on the design, and it was completely overgrown. Moss covered every surface, thick and green and undisturbed. Small trees had sprouted up around the wheels, their trunks already 6 or 7 inches in diameter. Ferns grew out of the truck bed. The thing looked like it had been sitting there for half a century, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I approached it carefully, my curiosity overriding my schedule. Finding abandoned equipment in old logging areas isn't that unusual, but something about this truck caught my attention. It was positioned oddly, facing away from the road rather than toward it, as if the driver had been trying to get deeper into the forest instead of leaving it. The door on the driver's side was closed but not latched, hanging slightly open. I pulled it wider, the hinges screaming with rust and disuse. The interior was in surprisingly good condition considering how long it had clearly been sitting there. The seats were rotted and full of holes where mice had nested, but the dashboard was still intact. What really caught my eye was that the keys were still in the ignition, dangling from a faded keychain. I leaned in further and popped open the glove compartment. Inside was a water-stained notebook, the kind workers use to log their hours and cargo. I pulled it out carefully and flipped through the pages. The entries were dated, starting in January 1973 and running through October of that same year. Each page detailed loads of timber, pickup times, delivery locations, all written in the same careful handwriting. I flipped to the last entry, dated October 17th, 1973. The handwriting was different here, shakier, more hurried. It read simply, "Heard it again tonight. 3rd time this week. Staying in the truck from now on. Not going out there after dark anymore." That was it. No explanation of what the driver had heard, no context, just that single ominous entry, and then blank pages for the rest of the notebook. I looked around the clearing, suddenly very aware of how quiet the forest had become. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just the whisper of wind through the high branches. I checked my watch and saw it was almost 4 in the afternoon. I had maybe 3 more hours of good daylight left, and I'd planned to camp in the area overnight to continue the survey in the morning. I set up my tent in a flat spot near my truck, which I'd parked on what remained of the old logging road. I had a small camp stove, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, and enough food for 2 days. As the sun started to set, I made dinner and sat on my truck's tailgate, eating and reviewing my notes from the day. The discovery of the old logging truck had thrown off my schedule a bit, but I'd still managed to cover about 60% of my planned grid. I'd finish tomorrow and be out by afternoon. Darkness comes early in the forest, especially in areas with heavy canopy coverage. By 7:30 it was fully dark, the kind of absolute blackness that city people never really experience. I had a battery-powered lantern hanging from my tent, casting a small circle of light, and I sat inside, reviewing maps and making notes. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the first sound. It was a knocking, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a heavy piece of wood. 3 deliberate strikes, evenly spaced, resonating through the forest. Then silence for maybe 30 seconds, followed by another 3 knocks from a different direction. I stopped writing and listened intently. Another set of knocks, this time from behind my tent. Then another from my left. They were coming from different locations, moving in what seemed like a pattern around my campsite. I've spent enough time in forest to know that trees make sounds. They crack and groan, branches fall, trunks rub against each other in the wind. But these weren't natural sounds. They were too regular, too deliberate, too evenly timed. Something was making them intentionally. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of my tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The light only penetrated maybe 30 feet before being swallowed by the trees and the night. The knocking continued. It moved in a circle around me, always staying just beyond the range of my flashlight. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks from a new location, pause, repeat. It went on for 15 minutes, then 20, then 30. I stood outside my tent the entire time, flashlight in one hand, my other hand resting on the bear spray attached to my belt. Whatever was out there, it was moving through the forest in a coordinated pattern, and it wanted me to know it was there. After about 45 minutes, the knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I waited another 10 minutes, listening for any indication of movement, but heard nothing. Eventually, I retreated back into my tent, but I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against my equipment bag, flashlight in my lap, listening to every tiny sound the forest made. The knocking started again around 11. Same pattern, same deliberate 3-knock rhythm, same circular movement around my position. This time, I tried something different. I picked up a fallen branch and struck it 3 times against a nearby tree, mimicking the pattern. The forest went completely silent. No knocking, no ambient noise, nothing. Then, after about a minute, the knocking resumed, but now it was faster, more aggressive. The intervals between sets got shorter, and the sound got louder, like whatever was making it had moved closer. I decided not to try communicating again. I sat in my tent and waited. The knocking continued for over 3 hours, circling my camp in those same methodical patterns. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from ground level, other times from higher up, like something was striking the trunks 20 or 30 feet above the ground. I counted the intervals, trying to find some pattern or meaning, but if there was a message in the rhythm, I couldn't decipher it. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something new. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but the heavy, deliberate tread of something large moving through the underbrush on 2 legs. They circled my camp just like the knocking had, staying just outside my light's range. I could hear branches breaking, hear the wet sound of feet pressing into muddy ground, but I couldn't see anything. My truck was parked about 20 feet from my tent, and I seriously considered making a run for it, locking myself inside the cab until morning. But something kept me frozen in place. It was the memory of that last log entry from 1973. Staying in the truck from now on. The driver had tried that, had hidden in his truck, and he'd never made it out. That truck was still sitting in the forest, keys in the ignition, surrounded by 50 years of growth. Whatever he'd been hiding from had found him anyway. The footsteps continued until just before dawn. As the first gray light started filtering through the canopy, they stopped. The knocking stopped. Everything stopped. I waited until I could see clearly, until the forest had returned to its normal daytime sounds of birds and small animals before I emerged from my tent. I packed up my gear as quickly as I've ever done anything, not even bothering to take down the tent properly, just stuffing everything into my truck. Before I left, I did one more thing. I hiked back to where I'd found the old logging truck and took photographs documenting everything. When I got back to civilization, I did some research. I found records of 3 loggers who went missing in that area in October 1973. Their truck was reported abandoned, but the official search was called off after 2 weeks with no bodies recovered. The area was deemed too dangerous for extensive search operations, and the case was eventually closed. I filed my survey report and recommended against any logging operations in that section. I cited environmental concerns, potential habitat disruption, things that sounded official and scientific. I didn't mention the truck, the log entries, or what I'd heard that night. The logging company accepted my recommendation, and ended up selling the land to a conservation trust. That area is now protected wilderness, and I hope it stays that way. I still do forestry work, still spend nights alone in remote woods, but I won't go back to that area. Some places should be left undisturbed, and some sounds you hear in the darkness shouldn't be answered or investigated. Whatever was out there that night, circling my camp in the darkness, I don't think it was trying to scare me away. I think it was trying to communicate, or maybe trying to understand what I was. And that's somehow more terrifying than any aggressive threat could have been. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have stayed the night or left immediately when the knocking started? Share your thoughts below. My name is Cassidy, and I work as a traveling nurse. That means I go wherever hospitals need temporary staff, usually for assignments that last anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It's not the most stable lifestyle, but the pay is good, and I get to see different parts of the country. In November 2019, I accepted a contract at a small hospital on the Oregon coast, near the town of Bandon. The facility specialized in long-term care for elderly patients, and they were desperately short-staffed heading into the winter season. Finding accommodation in small coastal towns can be challenging, especially on a nurse's budget. Most of the vacation rentals are either closed for the winter or priced for summer tourists. The hospital's HR department connected me with what they called staff housing, which turned out to be an old motel that had been converted into temporary lodging for medical personnel. The place was called the Seabreeze Motor Inn, though I never saw any signage to confirm that. It sat about 2 miles from the hospital, right off Highway 101, a long, single-story building with weathered blue paint and a gravel parking lot. When I arrived on a gray Sunday afternoon, the manager met me in what used to be the front office. Her name was printed on a small badge, but I'm focusing on my own experience here. She was probably in her 60s, with that weathered look that people get from spending their whole lives near the ocean. She handed me a key attached to a heavy plastic tag with the number 12 stamped on it, and explained that I'd be in the last room on the west end. She mentioned that I was currently the only person staying there, as the hospital's other traveling staff had finished their contracts the previous month. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a 1950s motel, small, maybe 200 square feet total, with a double bed, a tiny bathroom, a closet, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. The carpet was worn but clean, and everything smelled faintly of bleach and ocean air. There was a kitchenette area with a hot plate and a mini fridge and a small table with 2 chairs. The television was one of those old tube models that probably weighed 50 pounds. I didn't care about any of that. I just needed a place to sleep between 12-hour shifts. The first 2 nights were completely normal. I worked long days at the hospital, came back exhausted, ate something simple, and fell asleep almost immediately. The motel was quiet, which made sense given that I was the only person there. No traffic noise, no neighbors, just the sound of wind and the distant ocean. It was actually peaceful in a lonely sort of way. The 3rd night, I woke up suddenly at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone immediately. That instinctive check you do when something pulls you out of sleep. My heart was pounding, though I couldn't remember having a nightmare or hearing a loud noise. I lay there in the darkness, trying to figure out what had woken me, and that's when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. They were slow and deliberate, the sound of someone walking on the concrete walkway that ran along the front of all the rooms. Heel toe, a steady measured pace. I wasn't immediately alarmed because I assumed it was the manager doing some kind of late-night check on the property. The footsteps came closer, passing room 11, and then they stopped directly outside my door. I waited for them to continue, but they didn't. Whoever was out there was just standing at my door. I sat up in bed, watching the gap at the bottom of the door where a sliver of exterior light came through. I could see a shadow there, the dark outline of feet blocking the light. They stood completely still for what felt like several minutes, though it was probably only 30 seconds or so. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away down the walkway toward the far end of the building. I heard them fade into silence. I got up and looked out the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the parking lot. It was empty except for my car. No other vehicles, no person walking around, nothing. I checked the door to make sure it was locked, which it was, and tried to go back to sleep. It took a while, but eventually exhaustion won out. The next night, I woke up at exactly 2:47 again. This time, I was already tense, already listening for the footsteps, and sure enough, within a minute, I heard them. Same slow pace, same deliberate rhythm, coming down the walkway from the direction of the office. They passed each room in sequence, and I counted them in my head. 10, 11, and then they stopped at 12. My door. I was already out of bed this time, standing in the middle of the room with my phone in my hand. The shadow appeared at the bottom of the door again, feet positioned right at the threshold like someone was standing there, facing my room. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I walked quietly to the door and looked through the peephole. There was someone standing there, a person, visible in the yellowish light from the walkway fixture. They were wearing clothes that looked wrong somehow, outdated, a style I couldn't quite place, but that reminded me of old photographs from the 80s. Dark pants, a buttoned shirt, and a jacket that hung oddly on their frame. I couldn't see their face clearly because of the angle and the distortion from the peephole, but they were definitely there, standing perfectly motionless facing my door. My hand was on the deadbolt before I really thought about what I was doing. I wanted to confront whoever this was, to demand to know why they were standing at my door in the middle of the night. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the absolute stillness of the figure, or the strange clothes, or just instinct. But I didn't open that door. I stood there with my eye pressed to the peephole watching them. They stood there for at least 3 minutes without moving at all. No shifting weight, no looking around, no movement of any kind. Just standing there, facing my door like a statue. Then, without any transition or movement that I could detect, they simply turned and walked away. The footsteps resumed, moving back down the walkway toward the office, and then faded to nothing. I waited about 30 seconds, and then very carefully unlocked my door and opened it just a crack. The walkway was empty. I opened it wider and stepped out, looking both directions. Nobody was there. The entire motel was dark and silent except for that one light fixture. I walked a few steps in the direction the person had gone, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The concrete walkway was covered in a thick layer of dust and dirt. I could see my own footprints clearly where I'd walked to and from my room over the past few days. But there were no other footprints. The dust was completely undisturbed except for the marks I'd made. Whoever or whatever had been standing at my door hadn't left any trace of their presence. I went back inside and locked the door, but I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the parking lot and the walkway, waiting for sunrise. When it finally came, I drove straight to the hospital, even though my shift didn't start for 2 hours. I sat in my car in the parking lot and tried to convince myself I'd been dreaming or hallucinating from exhaustion. But the next night, the same thing happened. 2:47 footsteps, shadow at the door. I didn't look through the peephole this time. I just sat on my bed with all the lights on and waited for it to pass. The 4th night, same thing. The 5th night, I couldn't take it anymore. After my shift, I went back to the motel during daylight hours and found the manager in the office. I asked her about the history of the building, trying to sound casual. She was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually she told me that the motel had closed in 1987. A guest in room 12 had died, under circumstances she described as strange but wouldn't elaborate on. The place had sat empty for years before the hospital bought it and converted it to staff housing. Most people who stayed there didn't last more than a week or two before requesting different accommodations. I asked her why she hadn't warned me, and she said that most people never experienced anything unusual, and she didn't want to scare off staff before they even started. She offered to move me to a different room, but something about that felt wrong. If I moved, would whatever was visiting room 12 follow me? Or would it start appearing at someone else's door? I finished out my contract, all 3 months of it, in room 12. The footsteps came every single night at 2:47. I learned to sleep through them eventually, or at least to lie still and wait for them to pass. I never looked through the peephole again, and I never opened the door while the footsteps were there. On my last day, I left the key in the room and drove away without saying goodbye to the manager. I've had other travel nursing assignments since then, stayed in dozens of different places, but nothing has ever matched those 3 months in Bandon. Sometimes I wonder about the person who died in that room, about what happened to them, about why they, or something pretending to be them, keeps walking that hallway night after night. I wonder if they're looking for something, or if they're trapped in some kind of loop, endlessly repeating the same actions from when they were alive. Mostly, though, I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door that first night when I looked through the peephole. Would the figure have tried to come inside? Would it have spoken? Or would it have just stood there staring at me with whatever passed for a face? I don't know, and I'm grateful I never found out. Some doors are meant to stay closed, especially at 2:47 in the morning. Have you ever felt like something was standing just outside your door at night? What did you do? Did you look, or did you wait for it to leave? Let me know in the comments. My name is Sky, and I've been working as an outdoor educator for the past 8 years. I lead wilderness trips for teenagers, teach survival skills, and spend more time on trails than I do in any building. I know the Columbia River Gorge like most people know their neighborhood streets, every switchback, every viewpoint, every hidden waterfall. I've hiked Eagle Creek Trail at least 40 times, in every season, in every kind of weather. It's one of the most popular trails in Oregon, which means it gets crowded during peak season, but it also means I know exactly where people tend to wander off trail and where the dangerous spots are. In September 2022, I was doing a solo scouting run to check trail conditions before bringing a group of students out the following week. It was a Wednesday morning, midweek, when the trail sees less traffic, and I started hiking just after dawn. The air was crisp and cool, that perfect early autumn temperature before the real cold sets in. The trail follows Eagle Creek through a steep canyon, with massive cliffs rising on both sides and waterfalls dropping from impossible heights. It's stunning, but it's also unforgiving. One wrong step near the edge, and you're looking at a fall that nobody walks away from. I was about 4 miles in, past Punchbowl Falls, moving at a steady pace and making notes on my phone about trail erosion and areas that might be tricky for students. The morning sun was just starting to reach down into the canyon, creating those dramatic light shafts through the forest canopy. I was focused on the trail itself when something caught my eye about 200 yards uphill through the trees. A flash of color that didn't belong, that bright synthetic blue that outdoor gear companies love, but that nature never produces. I stopped and stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out what I was looking at. It was definitely fabric of some kind, positioned in a way that suggested it was a tent or tarp. That was unusual because this section of trail doesn't have any designated camping areas, and the terrain is too steep and rocky for most people to want to set up camp anyway. My first thought was that someone had gotten lost or injured and made an emergency camp, so I decided to investigate. Getting to the spot meant leaving the main trail and scrambling uphill through dense underbrush and over fallen logs. It took me about 15 minutes of careful climbing before I reached what turned out to be a small flat area, maybe 20 feet across, tucked between several massive boulders. And there, arranged with almost unnatural neatness, was a complete camp setup. There was a 2-person tent, still standing and properly staked, its fly pulled tight. Next to it was a backpack leaning against one of the boulders, and I could see a sleeping bag rolled up near the tent entrance. A small camping stove sat on a flat rock with a pot beside it. Everything looked organized, intentional, like someone had just stepped away for a few minutes to get water or use the bathroom. But something felt immediately wrong about the scene. The tent fabric was covered in a thin layer of dirt and pine needles. Not the kind of light dusting that accumulates overnight, but a heavier coating that suggested weeks or months of exposure. The backpack had moss growing on its bottom edge where it touched the ground. When I looked closer at the camping stove, I saw spider webs connecting it to the rock it sat on. This gear had been here for a long time, but it was arranged too perfectly to have been abandoned in panic or emergency. I called out, announcing my presence, asking if anyone was there. My voice echoed off the rocks and faded into the forest. No response. I waited a full minute, listening for any sound of movement, but heard nothing except the distant rush of Eagle Creek below. I approached the backpack carefully and checked the outside pockets. In one of them, I found a wallet. The driver's license inside belonged to someone I'll just refer to as a hiker, because using their real name doesn't feel appropriate. But what mattered was the date I'd seen on missing person flyers posted at trailheads all summer. This person had been reported missing 6 months earlier, last seen starting a day hike on Eagle Creek in March. Massive search efforts had been conducted. Helicopters had flown the canyon. Rescue teams had covered every inch of the main trail, but they'd found nothing. And here was their camp, 200 yards off trail, apparently undiscovered for half a year. I knew I needed to document everything for the authorities, so I pulled out my phone and started taking photographs. I shot wide angles showing the entire camp layout, close-ups of the tent and gear, detailed images of how everything was positioned. I photographed the backpack from multiple angles, and the contents I could see without disturbing anything. My hands were shaking slightly as I worked, partly from the exertion of the climb, but mostly from the creeping sense that something about this scene was deeply wrong. I must have taken 30 or 40 photos, methodically covering every detail. When I felt I'd documented enough, I started back down toward the trail, planning to hike out immediately and contact the sheriff's department. But as I was picking my way down through the rocks and brush, something made me check my phone to review the photos I'd taken, just to make sure they'd come out clearly. That's when I saw them. Mixed in with the photos of the camp were other images I absolutely did not remember taking. The first few shots of the camp were there, exactly as I'd intended, but then there was a photo of my own tent, the one I'd used on a solo trip 3 weeks earlier. It was taken from outside, looking in through the mesh door, and I could see myself inside, asleep in my sleeping bag. The angle was low, as if someone had been crouching or lying on the ground to take the shot. My stomach dropped. I scrolled forward. There were 5 more photos like this, different angles, all taken while I'd been sleeping. Some were zoomed in on my face. One showed my hand hanging out of the sleeping bag. All of them were time-stamped between 2 and 3 in the morning, on the night I'd camped alone on a different trail entirely, about 30 miles from here. That had been 3 weeks ago, and I'd been absolutely certain I was alone in that area. I stood there on the steep hillside, gripping my phone, feeling the forest press in around me. Someone had been at my campsite that night. Someone had stood outside my tent taking photographs while I slept, completely unaware and vulnerable. And I'd had no idea, no sense of being watched, no awareness of another presence. I scrolled through my phone's photo library with shaking hands, checking older images. There were more. A photo of me eating lunch at a trailhead 2 months ago. A shot of my car in a parking area taken from inside the tree line. An image of me filling water bottles at a stream photographed from behind a boulder. Dozens of photos I hadn't taken, scattered through my library going back almost 4 months, all showing me during various hikes and camping trips. All taken without my knowledge. The metadata on the photos confirmed they'd been taken with my phone, my camera. Someone had accessed my phone, used it to photograph me, and returned it without me noticing. Or worse, someone had somehow remotely accessed my camera. But that didn't make sense either, because many of these photos were taken in areas with no cell service. I scrambled down to the main trail faster than was probably safe, nearly twisting my ankle twice. When I reached the trailhead parking area, I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to calm down enough to drive. I called the sheriff's department and reported finding the camp and the identification. I told them about the location and the condition of the site. I didn't mention the photos on my phone. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew how insane it would sound, or maybe because I was too scared to admit out loud what it meant. 2 deputies met me at the trailhead an hour later, and I led them to the site. They documented everything, collected the gear as evidence, and called in a search team to comb the surrounding area. They asked me dozens of questions about exactly what I'd touched, what I'd moved, what time I'd arrived. I answered everything honestly, except I didn't tell them about photographing the scene. I said I'd just looked around and then come straight down to report it. Over the next week, the search teams found nothing else. No body, no additional gear, no explanation for how someone could vanish so completely after setting up such an organized camp. The family was notified that personal items had been found, but without remains, there was no closure, just more questions. I took my phone to 3 different tech experts, asking them to examine how someone could have accessed my camera remotely or added photos to my library. None of them found any evidence of hacking, malware, or remote access. The photos were genuine, taken with my device's camera, saved normally to my storage. They shouldn't have been possible, but they existed. I deleted every single photo from my camera roll and started backing everything up to a separate hard drive that never connects to the internet. I changed all my passwords and enabled every security feature available. But the photos keep appearing. Not every trip, but often enough. I'll finish a hike, get home, and find new images mixed in with the ones I intentionally took. Pictures of myself from angles I couldn't have shot. Images taken while I'm sleeping, or eating, or just sitting and resting. I still work as an outdoor educator, because it's what I know, but I don't do solo trips anymore. I always bring someone with me, always camp in groups, always stay aware of my surroundings in a way I never had to before. And I check my photos constantly, obsessively, looking for images I don't remember taking. The worst part isn't the invasion of privacy or even the fear of being watched. It's knowing that whoever took the original photos, whoever left that camp arranged so perfectly in the woods, they're still out there. They're still hiking the same trails I use. They're still watching. And somehow they can access my phone whenever they want, leaving proof of their presence, like calling cards, like warnings, like promises that they're never far away. What would you do if you found photos on your phone that you know you didn't take? Would you keep hiking, or would you give up the trails completely? Tell me in the comments below. My name is Roger, and I'm 52 years old. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a lighthouse keeper, which sounds more romantic than it actually is. Most lighthouses on the Oregon coast are automated now, so my job is really just maintenance. I check the electrical systems, replace bulbs, monitor the automated fog signals, and make sure everything runs smoothly. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. I've never been much for crowds or conversation. One of my regular assignments is Tillamook Rock Light, which most people call Terrible Tilly. It sits about a mile offshore from Tillamook Head, this massive chunk of basalt rising out of the Pacific. The lighthouse itself hasn't been operational since the 70s, but the structure still needs maintenance because it's a registered historic landmark. The rock is incredibly difficult to access. Weather conditions have to be nearly perfect, and even then, it requires a skilled boat captain willing to navigate the currents and rocks that surround the base. In March 2017, I scheduled a maintenance visit during one of the rare weather windows when the ocean was calm enough for safe approach. My usual captain picked me up before dawn, and we made the trip out as the sun was coming up. The rock is even more impressive up close than it looks from shore. Sheer cliffs rising straight out of the water, waves constantly hammering at the base, seabirds nesting in every available crack and ledge. There's a small landing area where supply boats used to dock back when the lighthouse was manned. But calling it a landing area is generous. It's really just a slightly less vertical section of rock with some corroded metal rings bolted into the stone. The captain dropped me off with my equipment and supplies, agreeing to return in 6 hours. That would give me enough time to complete the necessary inspections and repairs. As the boat pulled away, I felt that familiar sense of isolation settle over me. Being alone on Terrible Tilly is different from being alone anywhere else. You're surrounded by ocean in every direction, standing on this tiny piece of rock that feels more like a monument to human stubbornness than any kind of refuge. I spent the first couple hours inside the lighthouse structure, checking the automated systems, replacing some corroded wiring, and documenting structural damage for the Historical Society's records. Everything was routine, exactly the kind of work I'd done dozens of times before. Around mid-morning, I needed to inspect the lower sections of the rock, where weather damage is always most severe. That meant climbing down to the tide pools that form in the depressions and crevices at the base. Getting down there requires using the old access ladders bolted to the rock face. They're rusty and terrifying, but they've held for decades, and I trust them more than I trust most modern equipment. I clipped my safety harness to the guide cable and started the descent. The wind was picking up, slightly, which made the climb more challenging, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. About halfway down, I could see the tide pools below me, dark water reflecting the gray sky. When I reached the bottom and unclipped from the safety line, I took a moment to survey the area. The tide was out, leaving several pools exposed. This was actually perfect timing because it meant I could inspect areas that are usually underwater. I pulled out my camera to document any new cracks or erosion patterns, standard procedure for these inspections. That's when I saw the circle. At first, I thought it was just a natural formation, maybe rocks arranged by wave action, but as I got closer, I realized it was too precise to be random. Someone had created a perfect circle using shells, all of them positioned with their openings facing inward. The circle was about 8 feet in diameter, and it was positioned on a flat section of rock that sits above the high tide line, but below the main structure of the lighthouse. In the center of the circle was a dead harbor seal. I've seen dead marine animals before. It happens all the time along the coast. They wash up on beaches. They get caught in rocks. They die of disease or injury or old age. But this was different. This seal hadn't just died and been deposited there by waves. It had been placed there deliberately, positioned on its side with its flippers arranged symmetrically, and it had been cut. I'm not squeamish. I've gutted fish. I've cleaned game. I've seen what predators do to their prey. This wasn't any of that. The cuts on this seal were surgical in their precision. Long, straight incisions along the body, perfectly parallel to each other, spaced exactly the same distance apart. No tearing, no ragged edges, just clean cuts made with something extremely sharp. And the seal had been completely drained of blood. The flesh was pale, almost gray, and there wasn't a single drop of blood visible anywhere, on the rock around it or in the circle. I stood there, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain was running through possibilities. Maybe this was some kind of research project I hadn't been informed about. Maybe marine biologists had been out here studying something. But that didn't make sense because accessing this part of the rock requires specialized equipment and expertise, and I would have been notified of any other visits. Plus, what kind of research involves arranging shells in circles and draining animals of blood? I took photographs, lots of them, documenting the circle from every angle. I photographed the seal, the shells, the surrounding rock, everything. The whole time I was shooting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something obvious, some detail that would explain this, but nothing clicked. It just remained what it appeared to be, something impossible that was somehow right in front of me. The position of the circle bothered me almost as much as its existence. It was on a flat section of rock that you can't reach from the water. The cliffs around it are sheer vertical faces with no handholds, no way to climb up from below. The only way to access that spot would be using climbing equipment, rappelling down from the lighthouse structure above. But I'd just come down that way, and I would have seen any evidence of recent climbing activity. There were no fresh scratches on the rock, no rope marks, no signs that anyone else had been there. I looked up at the cliff face above the circle, trying to work out if there was any other possible access route. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were more shells arranged on a narrow ledge about 20 feet up the cliff face. Not a circle this time, just a line of them, all positioned the same way, with their openings facing the same direction. And higher up, another cluster of shells on an outcropping that looked completely impossible to reach without professional climbing gear. I spent another 30 minutes exploring the tide pool area, looking for any explanation, any sign of how someone could have created these arrangements. I found nothing. No footprints in the areas where sand had collected between rocks. No rope fibers caught on rough stone. No discarded equipment or supplies. Just the shells and the seal and the growing certainty that I was looking at something I didn't understand and probably didn't want to understand. When I climbed back up to the lighthouse, I radioed my captain, even though he wasn't due to return for another 2 hours. I told him I'd finished my inspection early and was ready for pickup whenever conditions allowed. I didn't mention what I'd found. I just wanted off that rock. While I waited, I sat in the old lighthouse keeper's quarters and looked through the photos on my camera. The circle was there, perfectly clear in high resolution. The seal was there, those impossible cuts visible in sharp detail. The shells on the cliff face were there. I hadn't imagined any of it. I copied all the photos to my phone as backup, some instinct telling me I needed redundant documentation. When the captain finally arrived, I could tell immediately that something was wrong. His face was closed off in a way I'd never seen before, and he wouldn't meet my eyes as I loaded my gear into the boat. We were pulling away from the rock when I mentioned that I'd found something unusual in the tide pools. I didn't go into detail, just said I'd seen some dead marine life arranged in a strange pattern. He didn't respond for almost a full minute, just kept steering the boat through the swells. Then, without looking at me, he said he wouldn't be going back to the western side of the rock anymore. When I asked why, he just shook his head and repeated that he wouldn't be going back there. His tone made it clear the conversation was over. Back on shore, I filed my maintenance report and included the photographs. I described exactly what I'd found, noting the impossibility of the location and the precision of the cuts on the seal. I sent it to the Historical Society and copied the Coast Guard and local marine mammal protection agencies. I expected questions, maybe an investigation, at minimum some acknowledgement that what I'd documented was strange and worth looking into. Instead, I got a brief email from the Historical Society thanking me for the report and informing me that they'd hired a different contractor for future Tillamook Rock maintenance. No explanation, no follow-up questions, just a polite dismissal. The marine mammal people never responded at all. The Coast Guard sent an automated reply confirming receipt. I've tried to research whether anyone else has reported similar findings at Terrible Tilly. There are plenty of ghost stories and legends associated with the lighthouse, the usual kind of folklore that grows up around isolated structures, but I couldn't find anything about ritualistic arrangements or surgically precise animal deaths. Either nobody else has seen what I saw, or people who have seen it don't talk about it. I still do lighthouse maintenance, but I've turned down every assignment that involves Tillamook Rock. I tell people it's because of scheduling conflicts or that the access is too difficult at my age. The real reason is that I don't want to see what else might be arranged in those tide pools. I don't want to climb down those rusty ladders and find another circle, another impossible placement of shells in locations nothing human should be able to reach. And I definitely don't want to find out what created those patterns and why. Sometimes late at night, I pull up those photos on my phone and study them, looking for details I might have missed. The shells are all the same species. The cuts on the seal are spaced exactly 3 inches apart. The circle's diameter is precisely 8 feet. Everything about it speaks to intention and planning and purpose. But whose purpose? And how did they access a location that requires expert climbing skills and specialized equipment to reach? Those questions keep me awake more often than I'd like to admit. Have you ever discovered something that you knew wasn't supposed to be there? Something that broke the rules of what's possible? Did you report it or did you keep it to yourself? Drop your answer in the comments. My name is Darius, and I'm 28 years old. For the past 2 years, I've been working the night shift at a 24-hour gas station on Highway 101 along the Washington coast. It's not glamorous work, but it pays my bills while I take community college classes during the day. The station sits in the middle of nowhere, about 15 miles from the nearest actual town. During the day, we get decent traffic from tourists and locals, but after midnight, it's mostly just truckers and the occasional insomniac making a late-night drive. Working nights changes you. Your sleep schedule inverts. Your sense of time gets warped, and you start to feel disconnected from the normal rhythms of life that daytime people take for granted. You also notice patterns that day shift workers miss. You see the same vehicles passing at the same times. You recognize the regulars who stop for coffee at 3 in the morning. You become familiar with the particular quality of silence that exists between 2 and 4 a.m. when even the highway goes quiet. It was during one of those quiet periods in winter 2021 that I first noticed him. It was a Thursday night, or technically Friday morning around 3:30. I was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when I heard the door chime. I turned around and saw a man standing just inside the entrance. He was maybe 40 or 50 years old, hard to tell in the harsh fluorescent lighting. He wore dark work pants, a plain button-up shirt, and a jacket that looked too thin for the January cold. His face was unremarkable, the kind you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. He walked straight to the candy aisle without acknowledging me, picked up a specific chocolate bar, then went to the coffee station and filled a small cup. Finally, he stopped at the lottery ticket display and stood there, staring at the options for almost 2 full minutes before pointing to a specific game. I printed the ticket with his numbers, rang up his purchases, and he paid in exact change. He never said a word, never made eye contact, just completed his transaction and walked out into the night. The whole interaction took maybe 3 minutes, and I wouldn't have thought anything of it except that the exact same thing happened the following Thursday at the exact same time. Same man, same clothes, same items purchased in the same order, same candy bar, small coffee, same lottery numbers. Exact change again. Still no eye contact, still no words spoken. I started to pay attention. 3rd Thursday, same thing. 4th Thursday, identical. By the 5th week, I was watching the clock and waiting for him. Sure enough, at 3:28 a.m. I heard a car pull up, though I never actually saw a vehicle in the lot when I looked out the window. The door chimed at 3:30 exactly, and there he was. Same routine, same purchases, same silent transaction. It was like watching a recording play out in real time. I mentioned it to the day shift manager during our handoff one morning, just as a curiosity. I said we had this regular who came in every Thursday night, always bought the same things, never spoke. The manager pulled up our sales records to check, and we could see the transactions clearly. Every Thursday at 3:30 a.m., same items, same total. But when I mentioned what the guy looked like and what he wore, the manager got quiet. He asked me to describe the customer again in detail. After I finished, He went to his office and came back with a folder. Inside was a missing persons flyer, the kind you see posted at rest stops and on community bulletin boards. The photo showed the same man I'd been selling candy and lottery tickets to for the past 5 weeks. According to the flyer, he'd disappeared in 2019, 2 years before I'd ever laid eyes on him. I felt my stomach drop. I insisted there had to be a mistake. Maybe it was someone who looked similar. Maybe the photo was just a bad match. But the manager showed me the details. The man's name, his age, the vehicle he'd been driving when he vanished, last seen in this exact area of Highway 101. Everything matched what I'd been seeing except for one impossible detail. This man had been missing for over 2 years. The manager suggested I might be mistaken about the timing or the appearance, that working night shift can play tricks on your perception. But I knew what I'd seen. I'd rung up this customer 5 times, watched him follow the exact same routine, taken his exact change. He was as real as anything else in that gas station. That Thursday night, I was anxious and wired, waiting to see if he'd show up again. I had my phone ready to take a photo, to get some kind of proof. 3:28 came and went. 3:30 arrived. The door stayed closed. No customer. I felt relieved and disappointed at the same time. Maybe it had been some kind of mistake after all, or maybe just stress and sleep deprivation creating false memories. But at 3:35, the door chimed. I looked up, and there he was. Same man, same clothes, same expressionless face. I watched him go through his routine, my hand moving toward my phone. He picked up the chocolate bar. He poured the small coffee. He walked to the lottery counter and pointed to his numbers without speaking. I printed the ticket with shaking hands, rang up the items, and told him the total. As he counted out exact change, I grabbed my phone and quickly opened the camera app. I held it low, trying to be subtle, and took a photo. The flash didn't go off, the phone made no sound, and the man didn't react. He placed his money on the counter, picked up his items, and walked toward the door. I watched him push through the exit, and then I looked out the window to see which direction he'd go, which vehicle he'd get into. But he just walked away from the building toward the highway, and then, about 20 feet from the door, he simply wasn't there anymore. I don't mean he walked out of my line of sight, or got into a car I couldn't see. I mean he was walking, and then he wasn't anywhere. He vanished mid-stride, like a video glitching out. I ran outside, looking in every direction. The parking lot was empty except for one semi-truck parked at the far end. Driver asleep in the cab. The highway stretched dark and empty in both directions. There was nowhere the man could have gone. No vehicle he could have gotten into, no place he could have hidden. He was just gone. I went back inside and immediately checked my phone to look at the photo I'd taken. The image showed the interior of the gas station, the counter, the lottery display. But where the man should have been standing, there was nothing. Just empty space. The image was perfectly clear otherwise, showing the products on the counter, the cash register, everything. But no customer. No person at all. I pulled up our security camera footage on the monitor behind the counter. Our cameras record everything, multiple angles covering the entire store. I scrolled back to 3:30 and watched. The footage showed me standing behind the counter, reaching forward to ring something up, taking money, bagging items. But I was interacting with empty air. The camera showed no customer. No one entered the store. No one stood at my counter. No one walked out. Just me, going through the motions of a transaction with nobody there. I watched the footage 3 more times, unable to believe what I was seeing. From the camera's perspective, I looked like I was having some kind of breakdown, talking to nobody, operating the register for no reason, taking imaginary money and putting it in the drawer. But I had the physical evidence. The chocolate bar was gone from inventory. The lottery ticket had printed. The money was in my drawer, exact change for the items purchased. I checked the sales record on the computer. The transaction was there, time-stamped at 3:31 a.m. All the items logged, correct total, proper amount received. Everything documented digitally. But the security footage showed nothing. no customer existed in any visual record. The day shift manager called me the next morning after reviewing the overnight footage. He asked if I was feeling all right, if I was having any problems, if I needed to take some time off. He'd seen me conducting a transaction with empty space, and he was concerned. I tried to explain, to show him the sales records, the lottery ticket, the money in the drawer. But from his perspective, I'd either entered a fake transaction or I was experiencing something that required professional help. I kept working night shift, but I started documenting everything more carefully. I noticed that every transaction I had during the overnight hours looked normal in person, but appeared strange on the security footage. When actual customers came in, real people with real cars and real conversations, they showed up on camera perfectly fine. But every single Thursday at 3:30, I went through that same routine with the same man who didn't exist on any recording. I started checking missing persons databases obsessively. Over the next few months, I found 3 more faces that matched regular customers I'd seen during night shifts. All missing, all last seen somewhere along Highway 101, all vanished between 2018 and 2020. And they all kept coming into the station, following their routines, buying their items, never speaking, never acknowledging me beyond the basic transaction. The security footage never showed any of them, but the sales records did. The inventory tracked every item they purchased. The money they gave me was real, could be counted and deposited. They existed in every way except visually. Or maybe I was the only one who could see them, for reasons I didn't understand and couldn't explain. I requested a transfer to day shift last month. My manager approved it without comment, probably relieved to move me away from the overnight hours. Someone else works those nights now, a guy who's been there about 3 weeks. I ran into him at a shift change last week and asked how the nights were going. He said they were quiet, boring, not much happening. I asked if he'd noticed any regular customers who came in at odd hours. He looked at me strangely and said, "No, the place was dead most nights. Nobody comes in between 2 and 5 a.m. usually." I didn't press the issue. Maybe the phenomenon only happened for me, or maybe the new guy just hasn't been there long enough to notice yet. Maybe those missing people, wherever they are or whatever they've become, only reveal themselves to certain observers. Or maybe I spent too many late nights in fluorescent lighting, and my brain created elaborate explanations for patterns that didn't really exist. But I kept one thing from those night shifts: a lottery ticket, the one I sold to the man from the missing persons flyer on what turned out to be my last Thursday night. I've checked the numbers twice. It's a winner, a small prize, nothing life-changing, $50. But that ticket is real, printed by a real machine with numbers chosen by someone who officially doesn't exist anymore. That ticket proves something happened, even if I can't explain what or why. If you worked night shift somewhere and started seeing the same person every week at the same time doing the same thing, would you investigate or would you ignore it? Let me know what you do in the comments. My name is Valentin, and I'm a 24-year-old geology student working on my master's thesis. My research focuses on lava tube formations in the Pacific Northwest, specifically how they develop and what kind of unique geological features form inside them over thousands of years. It's specialized work that requires spending a lot of time underground in conditions that most people would find claustrophobic and unsettling. I've always been comfortable in caves, though. There's something peaceful about being beneath the surface, surrounded by rock that's been forming for millennia. In July 2019, I was part of a 3-person research team exploring newly discovered lava tubes near Bend, Oregon. This is high desert country, completely different from the wet coastal forests most people associate with the Pacific Northwest. The landscape is dominated by volcanic rock, remnants of eruptions that happened thousands of years ago. Lava tubes form when molten rock flows underground, and the outer layer cools and hardens while the inner lava drains away, leaving hollow tunnels. Some of these tubes are massive, large enough to drive vehicles through, while others are barely wide enough to crawl through. The tube we were exploring that day had only been discovered a few months earlier by a local hiking group. It hadn't been surveyed or mapped yet, which made it particularly interesting from a research perspective. We were the first scientific team to enter it with proper equipment and documentation protocols. I was working with 2 other graduate students from my program, and we'd planned a full day of exploration and data collection. We entered the tube around 9 in the morning through a collapsed section that created a natural entrance. The opening was about 6 feet wide, and we had to scramble down a pile of broken rock to reach the actual tube floor. Once inside, we turned on our helmet lamps and let our eyes adjust to the darkness. The tube stretched in both directions, the floor relatively smooth, with occasional rocks and debris. The ceiling was about 8 feet high in most places, comfortable enough to walk upright. We decided to explore the western branch first, moving slowly and stopping frequently to take measurements, collect rock samples, and photograph interesting formations. The tube was everything I'd hoped for from a research perspective. The walls showed clear flow patterns from when the lava had been molten. There were small side passages branching off the main tunnel, and the occasional skylight where the ceiling had partially collapsed, letting in shafts of daylight. We'd been exploring for about 3 hours and had penetrated roughly 400 feet into the tube system when we found the camping equipment. It was sitting in a small alcove off the main passage, and at first I thought maybe it belonged to the hikers who discovered the entrance. But as we got closer and examined it more carefully, something felt wrong about the whole setup. There was a sleeping bag, still in its stuff sack, a small backpack leaning against the wall, a flashlight lying on the ground, batteries dead, some food wrappers, and an empty water bottle. What made it strange was the condition of everything. The fabric of the sleeping bag and backpack was covered in a thick layer of mineral deposits, the kind of calcification that takes years to develop in cave environments. Water seeping through rock dissolves minerals, and when it drips onto surfaces, those minerals slowly accumulate. The equipment looked like it had been sitting there for a very long time. One of my teammates picked up the backpack carefully and opened it. Inside were various personal items, including a wallet with identification. We all recognized immediately that we'd stumbled onto something that needed to be reported to authorities. The ID belonged to someone who wasn't in our research group, and finding their gear this deep in an unexplored cave system raised obvious concerns about their well-being. But the mineral deposits bothered me from a geological perspective. I've studied cave formations extensively, and I know how slowly those processes work. For that much calcification to build up on fabric, the items would need to have been there for years, maybe 5 or 10 years minimum. Yet the food wrappers looked relatively recent, and the equipment itself wasn't old enough to have been underground that long. It was a geological impossibility, but there it was, right in front of us. We were discussing what to do, whether to continue exploring or head back immediately to report the find, when we heard the screaming. It came from deeper in the cave system, from somewhere further along the main passage beyond where we were standing. It was human screaming, multiple voices, the kind of desperate, terrified sounds that people make when they're in extreme distress. All 3 of us froze, our lights pointed down the dark tunnel ahead. The screaming continued for maybe 10 seconds, echoing off the rock walls in a way that made it impossible to judge distance. Then it cut off abruptly, leaving us in absolute silence. We stood there, our hearts pounding, trying to process what we'd just heard. One of my teammates said we needed to go help whoever was down there, that people were clearly in trouble. But something about the screaming had felt wrong to me, in a way I couldn't articulate. We moved forward carefully, calling out to let anyone ahead know we were coming, and that we had equipment to help. Our voices echoed strangely in the tube, bouncing back at us from multiple angles. We'd gone maybe 50 feet further when the screaming started again. Same intensity, same multiple voices, same sense of panic and terror. But this time I noticed something that made my blood go cold. Mixed in with the screaming, underneath it almost, I could hear my own voice. Not someone who sounded like me, but actually my voice, saying words I'd never spoken. I could hear myself clearly saying, "Don't leave me here," over and over, with increasing desperation. But I wasn't saying anything. I was standing there, in silence, listening to my own voice come from the darkness ahead of us. I grabbed my teammate's arm and told them to stop, to listen carefully. They heard it too. All three of us could hear our own voices in that screaming, begging, and pleading, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. The screaming wasn't coming from other people who needed help. It was somehow using our voices, recreating sounds we'd made or would make, throwing them back at us from the darkness. We turned around immediately and started heading back toward the entrance. The screaming followed us, staying at what felt like the same distance behind us no matter how fast we moved. It would stop for 30 seconds or a minute, and we'd think maybe it was over. But then it would start again. Always multiple voices, always including fragments of our own speech mixed in with the screaming. About halfway back to the entrance, one of my teammates said we needed to stop and document this. He pulled out his audio recorder, a professional device we used for taking voice notes during fieldwork. He started recording, holding the device up toward the direction the sounds were coming from. The screaming was happening at that moment, echoing through the tube around us, and we stood there in silence while the recorder captured everything. After about 2 minutes, he stopped the recording and played it back. We heard our own voices on the playback, the ambient sounds of the cave, the scuffle of our boots on rock. But the screaming wasn't there. The recording was silent during the moments when we'd all clearly heard those desperate voices. Whatever was making the sounds didn't register on the recording equipment. That's when we ran. We didn't discuss it, didn't debate, just moved as fast as we could toward the entrance. The screaming followed us the entire way, sometimes loud and close, sometimes fading to barely audible. We scrambled up the rock pile at the entrance and emerged into bright July sunlight. And the moment we cleared the opening, the screaming stopped completely. We sat in the parking area for almost an hour, not talking, just trying to calm down. Eventually, we called the local sheriff's department and reported finding the camping equipment and personal belongings. We gave them the coordinates and described the location inside the cave system. We didn't mention the screaming because we knew how that would sound. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy called me to follow up. They'd sent a search and rescue team into the cave to investigate. The team found the camping equipment exactly where we'd described it, and they'd recovered it as evidence. The ID belonged to someone who'd been reported missing 3 years earlier, last seen hiking in that area. They were still investigating, but wanted to thank us for reporting the find. I asked if the search team had explored the full length of the cave system, if they'd gone deeper than where we'd found the equipment. The deputy said they'd penetrated about 600 feet in, past where our team had turned around. They hadn't found any signs of human remains or additional evidence. I almost asked if they'd heard anything unusual, but I stopped myself. If they'd heard the screaming, they would have mentioned it. I still have the audio recording from that day. I've listened to it probably 50 times, hoping to hear something I missed initially, some evidence that what we experienced was real and not a mass hallucination brought on by stress and fear. The recording is exactly what it sounded like during that playback in the cave. You can hear us breathing, hear our equipment, hear the ambient sounds of the underground environment. But during the sections when all three of us clearly heard screaming, the recording captures nothing but silence. I analyzed the audio file professionally, running it through software that can detect sounds beyond normal human hearing range. I found something that doesn't make sense. During those silent sections, there's a pattern in the subsonic range below 20 Hz, oscillating in a way that's too regular to be natural. It's not random noise or geological activity. It's structured, almost like it's encoding information, but I can't decipher what. The thing that bothers me most is my own voice in that screaming saying, "Don't leave me here." I never said those words in that cave, but a week after we'd returned home, I was having a nightmare about the experience, and I woke up my roommate because apparently I'd been talking in my sleep. He said I kept repeating, "Don't leave me here," over and over, the same words I'd heard coming from the darkness of that lava tube. I finished my thesis research using data from other cave systems. I've avoided lava tubes near Bend entirely, and I've steered other researchers away from that particular site by citing it as geologically uninteresting, which is a complete lie. One of my teammates from that expedition dropped out of the geology program entirely. The other finished their degree but switched to surface geology, refusing to do any more underground work. I still do cave research because it's my field and my passion, but I'm more cautious now about unexplored systems. Some places underground have been isolated from the surface world for thousands of years, and maybe there are good reasons why certain passages remain empty and undisturbed. Maybe some darkness shouldn't be entered with lights and equipment and scientific curiosity. Maybe some echoes aren't just sound bouncing off rock walls. Have you ever heard something underground that didn't make sense, that shouldn't have been possible in that environment? Would you go back to investigate, or would you leave it alone? Tell me what you think in the comments. My name is Meredith, and I'm 38 years old. I run a true crime podcast that focuses specifically on unsolved disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. It's not a hobby for me. It's a full-time commitment. I spend months researching each case, tracking down witnesses, reviewing old police reports, and visiting the actual locations where people vanished. The work is emotionally draining, but I believe these stories deserve to be told, and these missing people deserve to be remembered. In August 2023, I was investigating a series of disappearances that occurred in the Cascade Range near Mount Rainier during the 1990s. 3 separate people had gone missing over a 5-year period, all in roughly the same area, all under circumstances that left investigators baffled. No bodies were ever recovered, no evidence was found, and the cases eventually went cold. What connected them, aside from geographic proximity, was that all 3 were last seen on or near Forest Service Road 23, a remote gravel road that winds through dense forest at high elevation. I'd spent weeks preparing for this research trip, gathering every piece of information I could find about the disappearances. I had copies of police reports, newspaper articles, family interviews, and detailed maps showing the last known locations of each missing person. One of the cases particularly interested me because the person's vehicle had been found abandoned on Forest Service Road 23, completely intact, with the keys still in the ignition. The car had been discovered a week after they were reported missing, and despite extensive searches of the surrounding forest, no trace of the driver was ever found. I drove up to the area on a Wednesday morning, timing my visit for midweek, when I was less likely to encounter other people. The Forest Service road was in rough condition, barely maintained, with deep potholes and washboard sections that rattled my car's suspension. Dense evergreen forest pressed in from both sides, the trees so thick that even in the middle of the day, the light filtering through was dim and greenish. I'd driven maybe 8 miles in when I saw something that made me slam on my brakes. There was a car parked on the shoulder, about 50 yards ahead. A Honda Accord, older model, light blue color. My heart started racing because I'd memorized every detail of the missing person cases, and this matched perfectly. A 1994 Honda Accord, light blue, belonging to one of the people who disappeared in 1997. The license plate number was even correct. I had it written in my notes, and as I got closer and could see the plate clearly, the numbers matched exactly. I pulled over behind the Honda and sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. This vehicle had been recovered by police in 1997, processed as evidence, and eventually released to the family. It shouldn't be here on this forest road 26 years later, but there it was, sitting on the shoulder like it had never left. I got out slowly, approaching the Honda carefully. The paint was faded, and the body had some rust spots, but overall the car looked remarkably well preserved for something that should have been sitting in the elements for nearly 3 decades. I walked around it, taking photographs from every angle with my phone. The license plate was definitely correct, no question about it. When I tried the driver's door, it opened easily. The interior smelled musty, but wasn't in terrible condition. Leaves had blown in through a partially open window, and there was a thick layer of dust on the dashboard, but the seats weren't rotted, and the steering wheel was intact. The keys were in the ignition, just like the police report had described finding them in 1997. I reached in and turned the key without really thinking about what I was doing. The engine cranked once, twice, and then started. It ran rough for a few seconds, but then smoothed out into a steady idle. I was so shocked, I immediately turned it off. A car that had supposedly been sitting abandoned for 26 years should not start. The battery should be completely dead. The fuel system should be clogged. The engine should be seized. But it had started like it had only been sitting for a few days. I checked the odometer. The reading was 127 miles higher than what had been recorded in the police report when the car was found in 1997. 127 additional miles on a car that had supposedly been in police custody and then family storage for over 2 decades. That was impossible, but the numbers were right there on the display. Then I noticed the radio. It was on, tuned to a specific frequency, and I could hear faint static with occasional fragments of music or voices breaking through. I recognized the station identification when it came through clearly for a moment. It was a local AM station that had gone off the air in 1996. I know this because I'd researched it for another case. The station had been sold, reformatted, and eventually shut down completely. It hadn't broadcast in over 25 years, but somehow this car radio was receiving its signal. I took my phone out to call the sheriff's department to report that I'd found a vehicle connected to a missing person case. But before I could dial, I noticed something on the dashboard that made my hands start shaking. There was a Polaroid photograph lying face up near the windshield. Polaroids have a distinctive look, that square format with the white border, and this one appeared recent based on the color saturation. I picked it up carefully. The photograph showed a car parked on a forest road. My car, my exact vehicle, in its current position, parked behind the blue Honda. The photo had been taken from roughly where I was now standing, looking back at both vehicles. The date stamp printed on the white border said it had been taken 1 week ago, 7 days before I'd even decided to make this trip. I felt dizzy, like the ground was tilting under my feet. I looked around frantically, scanning the forest on both sides of the road, looking for any sign of another person, any indication of who could have taken this photograph. The trees were silent and still. No movement, no sounds except for the whisper of the wind through the high branches. I was completely alone, or at least I appeared to be alone. I backed away from the Honda quickly, returning to my own car. My instinct was screaming at me to leave immediately, to get out of this area as fast as possible. But my investigative training, all those years of research and documentation, told me I needed to record this, to gather evidence, to document everything I was seeing. I forced myself to be methodical. I took more photographs of the Honda from every angle. I photographed the Polaroid, making sure the date stamp was clearly visible. I recorded video of the interior, showing the keys in the ignition, the odometer reading, the radio still receiving that impossible station. As I was filming, something else caught my attention. There was a small notebook wedged between the driver's seat and the center console. I reached in and pulled it out. The pages were yellowed but intact, and it appeared to be a daily planner from 1997. I flipped through it carefully. The entries were mundane, appointments and reminders, nothing that seemed significant. until I reached the last page that had any writing on it. The final entry was dated 3 days after the driver had been reported missing. It was written in shaky handwriting, completely different from the neat script in earlier entries. It said simply, "They're still here. The others. I can see them now. Why didn't anyone tell me about the coordinates?" Below that were a series of numbers that I recognized as GPS coordinates. I immediately entered them into my phone's mapping application. The coordinates pointed to a location about 1.5 miles northeast of where I was currently standing, deeper into the forest, off any established trail or road. The map showed nothing but dense wilderness in that area. I sat in my car with the notebook in my hands, trying to decide what to do. Every rational part of my brain was telling me to drive away, to take what I'd found to the authorities, to let professionals handle whatever this was. But I'd spent my entire adult life investigating mysteries like this, chasing answers that everyone else had given up on finding. The coordinates were right there. I had them. I could hike to that location, see what was there, and potentially solve a 26-year-old mystery. I got my hiking pack from the trunk, made sure I had water, my phone fully charged, and a GPS device as backup. I marked my car's location carefully and started hiking into the forest, following the coordinates on my phone. The terrain was rough, no trails, just thick underbrush and fallen logs to navigate around. I kept checking my phone to make sure I was heading in the right direction. It took about 40 minutes to reach the coordinates. The location was a small clearing maybe 30 feet across, ringed by massive, old-growth trees. And in the center of the clearing was something I couldn't begin to explain. There was a perfect circle of bare ground, about 10 feet in diameter, where nothing grew. The soil inside the circle was a different color than the surrounding earth, darker and almost oily looking, and scattered around the circle's edge were personal items: a watch, a wallet, a backpack, a pair of glasses. Each item looked old, but preserved, protected somehow from the weather and decay. I recognized some of the items from the missing person cases I'd researched. The watch belonged to one of the 3 people who disappeared in this area. The backpack was described in detail in another case file. These were belongings of the missing, arranged around the circle like offerings or markers. But there was something else, something that made everything else seem almost mundane by comparison. Inside the circle, barely visible against the dark soil, were what looked like shadows of people. Not actual shadows, because the overcast sky wasn't creating shadows anywhere else in the clearing. These were impressions, dark human-shaped outlines on the ground, and there were 11 of them. 11 distinct human forms, frozen mid-movement, some appearing to be walking, others crouched or fallen. They looked like someone had spray-painted silhouettes onto the ground, except they moved very slightly, shifting and rippling like they were projected onto water instead of solid earth. I took photographs, though I knew already that they probably wouldn't capture what I was seeing. My hands were shaking so badly that most of the shots would probably be blurred. I recorded video, narrating what I was observing in a voice that sounded calm despite my internal panic. I documented the items around the circle, the strange soil, the impossible shadows. Then I made my biggest mistake. I stepped closer to the circle's edge to get a better photograph of one of the shadow figures. The moment my foot crossed that invisible boundary, I felt something change in the air around me. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I heard a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel, though the forest remained completely still. The shadow figures began moving faster, their rippling motion becoming more agitated, and I realized with absolute horror that one of them, the closest one to where I was standing, was beginning to take on more definition, more solidity. I could see features starting to form, a face becoming visible, and it looked like me. I stumbled backward, away from the circle, and ran. I didn't follow my GPS route back, didn't worry about the difficult terrain, just crashed through the forest as fast as I could move. I didn't stop until I reached my car, threw myself inside, and locked all the doors. I sat there, hyperventilating for several minutes before I could calm down enough to start the engine. The blue Honda was still parked ahead of me, but I didn't stop to look at it again. I drove past it and didn't look back. I made it to the main highway and drove straight to the nearest town with a sheriff's station. I tried to report what I'd found, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. The deputy who took my statement was polite but clearly skeptical. He said they'd send someone to check the area, but I could tell he thought I'd either made the whole thing up or experienced some kind of episode. 3 days later, I got a call from the sheriff's department. They'd searched Forest Service Road 23 and found no blue Honda Accord. No evidence that any vehicle had been parked in the area I'd described. They'd also attempted to reach the coordinates I'd provided, but the terrain was too difficult, and they'd had to turn back. They suggested that perhaps the stress of my work was affecting my judgment and recommended I speak with a mental health professional. I still have all my photographs and videos from that day. The Honda is clearly visible in the images, license plate readable, interior details sharp. The Polaroid I found is in a plastic evidence bag in my apartment. The coordinates from the notebook are saved in my phone, but I haven't gone back to that forest road, and I won't. Whatever is happening in that clearing, whatever those shadow figures are, I came too close to becoming one of them. The missing persons reports keep coming in. Over the years, since the original 3 cases, 8 more people have vanished in that same general area of the Cascades. The authorities attribute it to the dangerous terrain, to people getting lost in the vast wilderness, to tragic accidents. But I know better. There's something in that forest that takes people, that collects them somehow, that keeps them in that clearing in a state between existing and not existing. And I know because I almost joined them. If you found coordinates that might explain an unsolved mystery, but going there could be dangerous, would you go anyway, or would you let it remain unsolved? Share your thoughts below. My name is Alberto, and I'm 45 years old. For the past decade, I've been documenting abandoned industrial sites across the Pacific Northwest, focusing particularly on the architectural remnants of the region's economic past. I'm an urban explorer and photographer, though I prefer the term industrial archaeologist. These decaying buildings tell stories about the people who worked in them, the industries that sustained communities, and the inevitable march of economic change that leaves these massive structures empty and forgotten. In October 2020, I traveled to Astoria, Oregon, to photograph an abandoned salmon cannery on the Columbia River waterfront. The building had been scheduled for demolition in early 2021, which meant this was likely my last opportunity to document it before it disappeared entirely. The cannery had operated from the 1920s through the early 1980s, processing millions of pounds of salmon during its operational life. It had employed hundreds of workers at its peak, serving as an economic anchor for the community. Then the fishing industry changed, the salmon runs declined, and the cannery closed its doors in 1983. I'd obtained permission from the property owner to enter and photograph, signing liability waivers and agreeing to stay only during daylight hours. The building was massive, a sprawling complex of processing rooms, cold storage areas, worker facilities, and administrative offices. Much of it was in severe disrepair, with collapsed sections of roof, broken windows, and floors that couldn't be trusted to bear weight. I'd explored dozens of similar sites, so I knew how to move carefully and recognize structural hazards. I arrived around noon on a gray Sunday, the kind of overcast day that's actually perfect for industrial photography. The flat light eliminates harsh shadows and brings out textures in weathered surfaces. I spent the first hour working my way through the main processing floor, photographing the massive conveyor systems and machinery that had once operated around the clock during fishing season. Everything was covered in decades of dust and bird droppings, with rust consuming the metal surfaces and moss growing wherever water had found a way inside. Around 2 in the afternoon, I made my way to the workers' break room, a space I'd seen in historical photographs and was particularly interested in documenting. The room was exactly as I'd imagined it, frozen in time from the day the cannery closed. There were tables and chairs still arranged in rows, a bulletin board on one wall with yellowed papers pinned to it, and along the back wall a rack of time cards still mounted beside what had been the punch clock. I approached the time card rack carefully, my camera ready. What I found there made me stop and stare. The cards were still in their slots, names printed on each one in faded ink. But what caught my attention was that every single card showed a punch-in time for the same date, September 17th, 1983. That would have been near the end of the cannery's operation, possibly even the final day. More significantly, all the cards showed workers clocked in, but none of them showed anyone clocking out. Dozens of workers had started their shift that day, according to these cards. But the punch-out times were all blank. I photographed the time cards extensively, zooming in to capture the names and dates clearly. As I was reviewing the shots on my camera's display, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps. Heavy boots on concrete, the distinctive sound of work boots with hard soles. The steps were coming from somewhere deeper in the building, from the direction of the main machinery floor. My first thought was that despite the owner's assurances, I wasn't alone in the building. Maybe another urban explorer had entered, or perhaps a homeless person had taken shelter in one of the intact sections. I called out, identifying myself and explaining that I had permission to be there. The footsteps stopped immediately. I waited, listening, but heard nothing more. After a minute of silence, I returned to photographing the break room. I was documenting the bulletin board when I heard the footsteps again, this time closer and more distinct. They were moving with purpose, not the random wandering of someone exploring. They sounded like they were coming down the corridor that connected the break room to the processing floor. I turned toward the doorway, expecting to see whoever was walking, but the corridor was empty. The footsteps continued growing louder, clearly approaching my position, but no one was visible. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The dust on the floor near the doorway was being disturbed. I could see boot prints forming in the thick layer of dust, appearing one after another, as if an invisible person was walking into the room. The prints were fresh, dark impressions in the gray dust, and they were heading directly toward where I was standing. I backed away, my heart hammering, and the footprints stopped forming. The room fell silent again. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, camera clutched in my hands, watching those impossible footprints. They were real, physical impressions in the dust, proof that something had walked across that floor, even though nothing visible had made them. I decided then that I needed to leave, to get out of the building and rethink whether finishing this documentation was worth whatever was happening. But before I could move toward the exit, I heard a new sound. Machinery. The distant rumble and clank of industrial equipment starting up, the rhythmic pounding of conveyor systems, the whir of motors and gears. It was coming from the processing floor, the same area I'd photographed an hour earlier, where all the equipment was rusted and motionless. Professional curiosity overcame my fear. I had to see what was making those sounds. I moved carefully toward the processing floor, my camera, recording video now instead of taking still photos. As I got closer, the sounds grew louder and more complex. I could hear multiple machines operating, could distinguish individual mechanisms in the cacophony. It sounded exactly like what the cannery must have sounded like during operation, when shifts of workers processed tons of salmon through these systems. I reached the doorway to the processing floor and looked out at the space I'd photographed earlier. The machinery was motionless, just as it had been, rust-covered and silent. But the sounds were overwhelming, surrounding me from all directions, as if phantom machines were operating in the same space as the real broken equipment. I could hear workers shouting to each other over the noise, hear the specific sounds of fish being processed, hear everything that should have been happening if this were 1983, and the cannery were still operational. I raised my camera to film the scene, to record these impossible sounds. The viewfinder showed exactly what my eyes saw: empty, decaying machinery, dust and rust and abandonment. But the audio was capturing something. I could hear it through my headphones, the mechanical symphony of a working cannery. I was recording something that wasn't visibly there, but was somehow audibly present. That's when I saw the jacket. It was lying across one of the conveyor belts about 50 feet from where I stood. A worker's jacket, the kind employees wore in the processing areas, with the cannery's logo visible on the back. The jacket looked old but not ancient, faded but intact. What made it impossible was that it hadn't been there an hour earlier when I'd photographed this exact area. I had clear shots of that conveyor belt, and it had been empty. I approached the jacket slowly, still filming. As I got within 20 feet of it, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The jacket was moving slightly, as if being disturbed by a breeze, but there was no breeze in this enclosed space. And as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just moving randomly. The fabric was shifting as if someone was wearing it, as if invisible shoulders were shrugging inside it, invisible arms filling the sleeves. I reached out with one hand, still filming with the other, and touched the jacket. It was warm. Not ambient temperature, not the coolness you'd expect from fabric that had been sitting in an abandoned building. It was warm with body heat, as if someone had just been wearing it and had taken it off moments ago. I picked it up carefully, and that's when I saw the name tag stitched onto the front. It matched one of the names from the time cards in the break room, one of the workers who'd clocked in on September 17th, 1983, and never clocked out. My camera died. Not the battery running low, not a gradual failure, but an instant complete shutdown despite having been at 70% charge when I'd checked it 5 minutes earlier. The screen went black, and the device became unresponsive. I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. My phone was in my pocket, and I pulled it out to use its camera instead. It was also dead, completely powered off, and wouldn't respond to any buttons. The sounds of machinery were getting louder, more insistent, and I started to feel a pressure in my ears like I was descending rapidly in elevation. The temperature in the building dropped suddenly, cold enough that I could see my breath. I was still holding the warm jacket, this impossible piece of evidence, and I knew I needed to leave immediately. I ran. I left my camera bag behind, left my equipment, just ran for the exit with the jacket clutched in my hand. The sounds followed me through the building, the phantom cannery operating at full capacity, and I swear I could hear voices calling out names, the names from those time cards, calling the workers back to their stations. I burst out of the building into gray daylight and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw the jacket into my trunk, got in, and drove away from that waterfront without looking back. It wasn't until I was 20 miles down the road that I pulled over to check my equipment. My camera was still dead, completely unresponsive. My phone remained powered off. I pulled out my laptop from my car and tried to download the photos I'd taken before everything died. Most of the images were fine, clear shots of the empty cannery, the time cards, the machinery. But the video I'd started recording right before my camera died was corrupted, almost completely unwatchable. Most of it was just digital noise and distortion, but there were a few frames that were clear enough to see. In those frames, visible in the background behind the rusted machinery I'd been filming, there were people. Dozens of people, translucent and flickering, wearing workers' clothes from the 1980s, moving through their routines, operating equipment that no longer existed in physical form. And in the clearest frame, the one I've enlarged and studied hundreds of times, you can see them all looking directly at the camera, looking directly at me. Their faces are distinct enough to compare with the names on those time cards, and I've identified at least 15 of them from old employee records I've found. Every single one was working at the cannery on September 17th, 1983. None of them ever left. Something happened that day, something that trapped them in that building, and 40 years later, They're still there, still working their shift, still waiting to clock out. The jacket is still in my trunk. I've never taken it out, never examined it more closely. It's evidence of something I experienced but can't explain. Proof that the past doesn't always stay past. That some places hold on to the people who occupied them in ways we don't understand. The cannery was demolished in January 2021, torn down and hauled away. But I wonder if that really ended anything, or if somewhere in the space where it stood, phantom machinery still runs, and invisible workers still process fish that aren't there, following routines that death itself couldn't interrupt. Would you have taken that jacket as proof, or would you have left it there? And if you had evidence of something impossible, would you show it to anyone or keep it hidden? Let me know in the comments what you would do. My name is Lyra, and I'm 41 years old. I've worked as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service for the past 15 years, currently stationed in Seattle. My job involves monitoring weather patterns across the Pacific Northwest, issuing forecasts and warnings, and investigating atmospheric anomalies that don't fit standard models. I've studied storm systems, temperature inversions, unusual precipitation events, and every kind of weather phenomenon this region produces. I thought I'd seen everything the atmosphere could do until January 2024. It started with a data anomaly that one of my colleagues flagged during a routine analysis. We have automated weather stations scattered throughout Washington and Oregon, continuously collecting data on temperature, wind speed, humidity, and precipitation. One station in the North Cascades was showing something unusual. According to its readings, a specific location had received continuous rainfall for 96 hours straight. That by itself wasn't remarkable because the Cascades get enormous amounts of precipitation, especially in winter. What was remarkable was that satellite imagery showed absolutely no cloud cover over that exact area during the same time period. I pulled up the satellite data myself, thinking there must be an error in the records or a malfunction in the ground station. But the images were clear and unambiguous. For 4 consecutive days, that 2-mile radius area had been completely visible from space, no clouds above it whatsoever. Yet the precipitation gauge was recording steady rainfall, measuring accumulation that matched what you'd expect from a moderate storm. The data didn't make sense from any meteorological perspective. Rain requires clouds, requires specific atmospheric conditions, requires a moisture source. You cannot have rain falling from a clear sky. I filed a maintenance request for the weather station, assuming the precipitation sensor was malfunctioning. But the technician who serviced it reported that all equipment was functioning perfectly and had been recently calibrated. The readings were accurate according to every diagnostic test. That meant either the satellite data was wrong, which seemed unlikely given that multiple satellites confirmed the same thing, or something impossible was happening in that location. Professional curiosity demanded investigation. I requested permission to conduct a field assessment, explaining that we had contradictory data that needed ground truth verification. My supervisor approved a day trip with the understanding that I was simply checking equipment and documenting local conditions. I loaded measurement instruments into my vehicle and drove out early on a Wednesday morning in late January. The location was remote, accessible only by logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The weather station sat near a small campground that operated seasonally, closed during winter months. As I drove closer to the AA coordinates, I started noticing something strange. The forest around me was dry. The ground was dry. The trees showed no signs of recent precipitation. But about a quarter mile from my destination, I hit a boundary where everything changed. It was raining. Not drizzling, but actual steady rainfall. The kind of consistent precipitation that the Cascades are known for. I could hear it drumming on my roof, see it streaming down my windshield. But when I looked up through the windshield, I could see blue sky. Not overcast, not gray clouds, but clear blue sky with the sun visible. The rain was falling from nothing, from empty atmosphere, defying every principle of meteorology I'd spent my career studying. I pulled over and got out, standing in the rain while looking up at clear sky. The sensation was profoundly disorienting. Rain was soaking my clothes and hair. I could feel the drops hitting my skin, could see them splashing on the ground around me. But there was no source for this precipitation. I held up my hand and watched raindrops hit my palm, watched them roll off my fingers. They were real, physical, completely normal raindrops, except for the fact that they were falling from clear sky. I pulled out my instruments and started taking measurements. The rain temperature registered at exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. I checked my thermometer 3 times, thinking it must be malfunctioning, but the reading remained consistent. The rain was body temperature. Human body temperature precisely. That was impossible. Rain forms in cold upper atmosphere and falls through varying temperature layers. It should be cold, or at worst, ambient air temperature. It should never be 98.6 degrees. I drove further into the affected area, following the logging road toward the campground. The rain continued steady and warm, falling from impossibly clear sky. When I reached the campground, I found 5 tents set up in various campsites. Vehicles were parked beside them. Camping gear was arranged outside. Folding chairs sat around fire rings. Everything looked normal for a campground, except that it was officially closed for the season, and everything was soaking wet from the rain that shouldn't exist. I approached the first tent and called out, announcing myself and asking if anyone was there. No response. I unzipped the entrance and looked inside. The tent was empty, sleeping bags laid out but no occupants. Personal belongings were scattered around, phones and wallets and clothing, as if people had just stepped away temporarily. I checked the second tent and found the same thing. Empty, but clearly occupied recently. Possessions left behind. No sign of the people themselves. All 5 tents were identical in this regard. Set up properly, gear arranged, personal items present, but no people anywhere. The vehicles all had keys in the ignitions. Coolers contained fresh food. A coffee pot sat on a camp stove with coffee still in it, cold but not spoiled. Everything suggested that people had been here very recently, possibly even that morning, but they were simply gone. I noticed something written on the inside of one tent, condensation on the waterproof fabric forming words. The same message was in all 5 tents, written in that temporary way that moisture creates on cold surfaces. Just coordinates. GPS coordinates that pointed to a location about half a mile from the campground, deeper into the rain zone. Every instinct told me to leave immediately, to report what I'd found to the sheriff's department and let them handle it. But I was already committed to investigating this anomaly, and those coordinates represented the potential center of whatever was causing this impossible precipitation. I marked my current location on my GPS unit, made sure my phone had the route back programmed in, and started hiking toward the coordinates. The rain continued steadily as I walked, warm and persistent. I took samples in collection bottles, measuring pH levels and checking for any unusual chemical composition. The water was clean, pure even, no contaminants or pollutants. Just warm rain falling from clear sky, defying explanation. After about 20 minutes of hiking through dense forest, I reached the coordinates. There was a depression in the ground, roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, and it was full of water, a pool that had formed from collecting the rain that had been falling continuously. The water was perfectly still despite the rain hitting its surface, no ripples forming, no disturbance visible. It looked more like a pool of mercury than water, that same quality of unnatural stillness. I approached the edge carefully and looked into the water. It was dark, impossible to see how deep it went, but I could see my reflection on the surface, except my reflection was wrong. It wasn't moving with me, wasn't mimicking my actions. It was just staring up at me with an expression I wasn't making. a look of profound sadness or resignation that I wasn't feeling. I knelt down and carefully collected a water sample from the pool. The water was warm, the same 98.6 degrees as the rain. I sealed the sample container and was preparing to return to my vehicle when I noticed something else. The pool's surface was beginning to show patterns, symbols, or letters forming in the still water, appearing and disappearing like something was writing from underneath. I pulled out my phone to photograph the patterns, and that's when I saw the data. My phone showed I had a strong cellular signal, despite being deep in a forest area where coverage was usually impossible. And I had dozens of missed calls and text messages, all from the National Weather Service emergency line, all time-stamped over the past 6 days. 6 days. But I'd only been here for a few hours at most. I checked my watch against my phone, and they showed different times. My watch said it was early afternoon, which matched what I remembered. My phone said it was late evening 6 days later. I looked up at the sky, trying to judge the sun's position, trying to get some objective measurement of actual time. The sky was still clear, still blue, but I couldn't locate the sun. The light was uniform, directionless, like being inside a perfectly lit room rather than outdoors. I started back toward my vehicle immediately, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. The rain continued falling, warm and steady. My GPS was behaving strangely, showing my position jumping around randomly, sometimes placing me miles from where I knew I actually was. I switched to using my compass for navigation, following a bearing back toward the logging road. When I finally reached my vehicle, after what felt like an hour of hiking, my phone updated again. Now it showed 9 days had passed. 9 days since I'd left Seattle to investigate this anomaly. But my watch still showed only a few hours had elapsed. My vehicle was where I'd left it, but it was covered in a thin layer of moss, the kind of growth that takes weeks or months to develop. I got in and started driving, not bothering to pack up my equipment, just wanting to get out of the rain zone as quickly as possible. About a quarter mile down the logging road, I crossed back into normal conditions. The rain stopped instantly. The sky became overcast in a normal way, and everything felt right again. I checked my phone, and the timestamp matched my watch now. Only a few hours had passed since I'd left Seattle. I drove straight to the nearest town with cell service and called my supervisor. I reported finding the abandoned campground and provided the coordinates. I didn't mention the warm rain falling from clear sky, the impossible pool, or the time distortion I'd experienced. I just said I'd found what appeared to be an abandoned camping area that needed to be checked by authorities. Back at the lab, I analyzed the water samples I'd collected. The results came back with something that made me physically ill. The water contained DNA, human DNA suspended in solution at concentrations that shouldn't be possible. And it wasn't just traces from contamination. The water was saturated with genetic material from multiple individuals. The lab identified 11 distinct DNA profiles in the samples. 3 days later, I received a call from a sheriff's deputy. Search and rescue teams had investigated the campground I'd reported. They'd found 5 vehicles registered to people who'd been reported missing over the past week. Families had filed missing person reports when their loved ones failed to return from camping trips. The total number of missing individuals was 11 people. The campground has been thoroughly searched. No bodies were found. No evidence of foul play was discovered. The vehicles and camping equipment have been collected as evidence, but there's no explanation for where the people went. The official conclusion is that they somehow got lost in the surrounding wilderness, though 11 experienced campers all vanishing simultaneously without any trace is unprecedented. I still monitor that weather station. The rain hasn't stopped. 6 months later, it's still falling in that exact 2-mile radius, still registering the same temperature, still falling from clear sky according to satellite data. The precipitation totals are astronomical now, enough water to fill a small lake, but it all seems to collect in that pool I found. And sometimes, when I review the satellite imagery very carefully, I can see patterns in how the rain falls, patterns that look almost like movement, like shapes trying to form. I submitted a detailed report to my supervisors, documenting everything I observed, including the impossible aspects that defy meteorological explanation. The report was acknowledged and then quietly buried in archives. I was thanked for my thorough investigation and reassigned to routine forecasting duties. Nobody wants to discuss what I found, what the water sample showed, or what happened to those 11 people. I think about them often. I think about that pool of unnaturally still water containing their DNA, their genetic essence suspended in solution. I think about the warm rain that never stops falling, rain at precisely human body temperature. And I think about what it means that the rain never stops, that it's been falling for months now from clear sky, defying every law of physics and meteorology. I believe the rain is them. Somehow those 11 people were transformed, broken down to molecular components and dispersed into an atmospheric phenomenon that shouldn't exist. They're still there in that area, still present, but no longer in any form we'd recognize as human. And I don't know if what happened to them was natural, supernatural, or something else entirely. I don't know if they're conscious in any way, if they're suffering, if they want to be found, or if they want to be left alone. What I do know is that I go back sometimes, driving to the edge of the rain zone but never entering it again. I sit in my car and watch the rain fall from clear sky, and I wonder if somewhere in those drops are the people who vanished, if they're trying to communicate, if they're warning others away or calling for help. I'll never know, and that uncertainty haunts me more than any definitive answer could. If you discovered a weather phenomenon that defied all scientific explanation and might contain the remains of missing people, would you continue investigating or would you leave it alone? Drop your answer in the comments below. Thank you for watching Bleak Fears. If these 11 disturbing accounts from the Pacific Northwest left you unsettled, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the unexplained. Share your own strange experiences from the forests, coastlines, and remote roads of this region in the comments below. Until next time, stay vigilant out there